tend to go off the track.
Okay. Who are some of your poetic influences? Favorite poet, favorite poem? How do you feel you've influenced the younger poets you've worked with?
Well, lots of, as you read, as one is reading a lot of poetry growing up, there were many directions that, I was curious about. I was reading off more contemporary work, and then I went into poetry of the past. I think that's how it, sort of happens in school. I was reading the Romantics, and then on my own I was reading beat writers, started to read those, and those writers in high school. On the Road had come out, and Howl had come out. I felt that, there was a lineage connection to Whitman, of course, to Walt Whitman, reading Emily Dickinson in college, and then came on Gertrude Stein, who I thought was, pretty wild. There's a way that she's, you're following her, the grammar of her thinking, and the way she plays with parts of speech, so that parts of speech are morphed in her texts, where suddenly she'll have a title, A Piece of Coffee. You don't generally say a piece of coffee, you say a piece of pie, and that kind of thing. Things that sort of come up against your expectation, and she would move things around in an interesting semantic way with also very simple vocabulary. And she talked about the poetry is really nouns, about nouns and naming, that prose is verb forms. I was very interested in this notion of hers, the continuous present, so that one tries to create a text that keeps, moment to moment, staying in the present. And some of that, I think we performed a little work like that last night. So I'd say Gertrude Stein was important as a much younger person. I had a high school teacher who taught us, read to us aloud, which was often not done in school when I was growing up. You'd be given a poem, and you'd be told, read it and sort of translate it, interpret it. What is it about? And then it would be very neatly explained. It was never sounded. It was never came aloud. And then in my studies of, oral traditions and other cultures, it's very important, of course, but the hearing it aloud is the transmission. It's like having a gong or a bell, and you have to hit it to hear it, that kind of thing. So the idea of sounding, which is a word I use a lot in various texts, that you have to sound the gong. And in Thailand, there's something called tibat poet. It's a kind of poetic idea where you literally have to sound. You have to make that sound to have it activated, have it alive. It's like plugging in. Ambrose and I lived in Bali several times. Ambrose first when he was about 8 years old, and then later in high school, where we studied the music and dance and mask painting and the culture really of the Bahasa. Well, it's the Bahasa language, but there's many languages in Bali. There's the old Javanese, there's Balinese. This is an island that's part of the Indonesian archipelago, many islands. And this is an island where this particular culture has stayed relatively extant. I mean, it's been overrun with tourism, and it's considered in some ways this paradise, and it's sadly not even owned by the people who live there anyway. That's a whole other story in the political ups and downs. But the notion, the culture there, and this is a culture where they don't really have a word for art, because art is so ingrained and embedded in what they do. But we studied, and Ambrose was quite a good gamelan player, so we studied gamelan music, and the gamelan is a orchestra with a number of instruments. You don't play solo instruments. You're all you're playing individually, but you're playing in a kind of a circular phrase. Interlocking. And the notion of that kind of orchestra, I think 26 pieces, is very much like their cosmology, which is the notion of that we're all on our different life cycles, and as humans and individuals, and then plants are all the different plants, and all the different animals, and sometimes in life is cut short by this or that, tragedy, illness, etc. But there is a kind of general human span and a span for the insect world and so on. So, you start to see the way we're interconnected with everything else, and that we intersect at these interesting points. So the orchestra is sort of a small model of that, these different instruments going at different speeds and yet intersecting at various points. So that was interesting to me as a structure and as a form, and actually as a form for writing. That, there were things in my studies that were, it wasn't just going to other poetry to have ideas about structures and forms. And I mean, yes, you go through traditional prosody and poetic forms and what the sonnet is, what the sestina is, the ballad, these different, the pantoum, etc. And these traditional forms that have been sort of noted and codified, and you can play with those and sort of rebel around those. There's also just free writing, as I think some of the people here in this community have been doing. But the notion of this idea of a more circular form and then intersecting in a way. So that was one notion from that culture about ways of working within. So that this long poem has recurring themes, and there's an early part called, I think it's called Nam for Ambrose, a history lesson for my son. So it was, and I had never been to Vietnam, but I knew people who had served there, and I knew people who had protested the war, and I was very involved with, those kinds of things in the 60s. And then, so it was kind of a little bit of a part of the poem to, I think maybe you had been studying it in school. There was some question in any case. And then later in 2000, I was able to actually go to Vietnam, and I felt it was very much connected to me and my generation, that war. And so what I noticed, of course, that there were very few people my own age, because so many of them had died, people over there, and also many people had died in the U.S. and other places. And then, so there were very old people, very young people who had been born after the war. But that also made me think about this idea of circular time and meeting young people who said we have to move on, we have to we have to be in another time frame here. And yet it was important to retain these memories. So there's a section in the poem that's later on in the poem in Book 3 called Dark Arcana, and that is an account, really, from notes from that trip to Vietnam. So, in terms of themes and points, that's, something that's, I think, been inspired by, again, other forms, not just other poets and other poems, but other kinds of forms and investigations. Certainly in the terms of the chant poem, I was, this Maria Sabina, which someone gave me a recording of this Mazatec Indian shaman, a woman who lived in Oaxaca and would take the magic mushrooms and guide people on these all-night sort of chants. Veladas, they were called, V-E-L-A-D-A, Spanish word, which means vigil. And that's where the fast-speaking woman came from, this notion of I'm a fast-speaking woman, I'm a fast-rolling woman. And I had already started this woman list, probably in the early 70s, and then learning of Sabina, and this is one of the great voices of the last century, a woman who had no education, was barefoot her whole life, lived in incredible poverty, and each people, anthropologists and others, and various artists started to seek her out. She died in the mid-80s, but that was an amazing figure for me. I looked to women writers, I think, and I looked at some of the women associated with the beat movement, such as Diane de Prima and Joanne Tiger and others. And there's a whole book called Women of the Beat, which you should check out as well, because there's a lot of unvoiced work there.